You're watching Central Television at the heart of the ITV network. Now we join ITN for the morning news.
Killings fail to stop mass demonstrations across Romania. Good morning, it's 5 o'clock on Friday the 22nd of December. This is ITN's morning news. The headlines. Romanians took to the streets in their thousands again last night, just hours after troops had gunned down scores of demonstrators in incidents across the country. In Bucharest, tens of thousands chanted "We won't leave" as tanks surrounded the university square. Elsewhere, 40 people died as two buses crashed head-on in Australia. And the Brandenburg Gate, Berlin's symbol of the Cold War, has been breached. Also in this morning's programme, Britain's astronauts fly in for Christmas, but there's no holiday from Russian homework, a report in our world news. And from American television, the priests who protested over military aid to El Salvador now face death threats. But first, the main news and to Romania. The Soviet news agency TASS says tens of thousands of people massed on Bucharest's University Square late last night. Troops firing tear gas canisters failed to disperse them. Another 5,000 gathered outside the Intercontinental Hotel. Sporadic shooting has been heard throughout the capital overnight. Meanwhile, the death toll rises. In Bucharest, 20 students were killed as they ran to help people who had been crushed by armoured vehicles. Budapest Radio reported 32 demonstrators shot dead in Cluj. They also say an unknown number of people were killed in Târgu Mureș in Transylvania. At Arad, troops dispersed 3,000 demonstrators, then lined up and shot the leaders.
President Ceausescu addressing a showpiece workers' rally in central Bucharest yesterday. But there were more signs of challenges to his hardline communist rule. Along with the reports of escalating violence throughout the country came jeers and shouts at the rally itself. "Down with Ceausescu" was chanted, interrupting his televised speech and forcing him and the broadcast to stop. Radio listeners heard military music cut in. A Romanian exile who doesn't want to be identified phoned his wife from London. She saw thousands flee the rally only to clash with armed police and troops.
Am văzut niște mașini blindate, roșii, portiera deschisă și soldați care stăteau cu arma așa, parcă vreau să tragă în oameni. Groaznic.
Cred.
Vreau să mă gândesc dimineața cine este, ce s-a întâmplat, ce cadavre s-au mort, probabil că sunt acum păstrați. După rafalele astea, cred că n-au fost singuri.
These first pictures of the city of Timișoara show where the protests started. Police still patrol, riot damage is evident. And the demonstrators are getting support from the neighbouring country of Hungary, where marchers turned out in the streets of the capital Budapest, calling for Romania's freedom. In London, a vigil was held outside the Romanian ambassador's residence. Red paint was daubed on his walls and President Ceausescu ridiculed, but many say he is a man who will do all he can to hold on to power.
At least 40 people have died and dozens were seriously injured in a head-on crash between two tourist buses in Australia. The accident happened on the Pacific Highway between Sydney and Brisbane. Police said it was the worst crash in Australian history, and some passengers were still trapped in the wreckage 5 hours after the collision. Eyewitnesses said the two buses were embedded in one another. Police are investigating the cause. President Endara imposed a curfew in Panama City last night. American troops continue to meet pockets of fierce resistance, seen when the 82nd Airborne Division moved in on the Marriott Hotel to free trapped civilians. In the United States, the first of the 19 troops killed in action have arrived back at the Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. The East Germans have dismantled the Berlin Wall at the Brandenburg Gate, one of the last symbols of the Cold War. The breach was made just after midnight as cranes pulled away whole segments of the wall. This afternoon, the leaders of East and West Germany will officially open the crossing.
The Brandenburg Gate came to symbolise the Cold War division of Germany since it was sealed off by the Berlin Wall. To the jubilation of onlookers, East German workers began their historic task. More than 1,000 people were waiting on the western side of the wall for this, the most important of the 20 crossings that have been opened since East Germany lifted travel restrictions 6 weeks ago. The work went on through the night as piece by piece the barrier came down. Then the moment they'd all been waiting for. The first segment of the wall wrenched from its roots by East German cranes. It was another night of celebration. This afternoon, the two German leaders, Chancellor Helmut Kohl and Prime Minister Hans Modrow, will meet at the new crossing. But for now, a simple handshake was enough for the Berliners.
A government inspector is to test airport security by trying to smuggle fake explosives onto aircraft. He will pose as a terrorist to check new safety measures introduced after the Lockerbie bombing. A court has heard how security at Gatwick was breached when a student was able to walk into the cockpit of a parked Ward Air jet. He was only discovered when he tried to start the aircraft and engineers working on an engine felt a blast of air. In a special service, the people of Lockerbie have remembered those who died when a bomb exploded on board Pan Am Flight 103 a year ago. American and British relatives gathered to dedicate a memorial stone to the 270 who were killed.
We have changed. But to say that we can never live life joyfully again is to say to the terrorists, here, you can have our lives as well. That I refuse to give them.
We'll take a break now. Coming up next, the world news, which includes a progress report on the training of Britain's first astronauts. Stay with us.
For every man that wears Brute, there's a woman who loves the way he smells. Because there's something about Brute that's good to be close to. And nobody knows that better than a woman.
Hello? Andy, I was just thinking about you.
Brute, a great range of Christmas gifts from Fabergé, from you to him.
Labatt's Canadian Lager, regular and strong.
Thanks a lot, buddy. Didn't any of you guys tell him the bottle's got a twist-off cap? Nope.
Labatt's Canadian Lager, regular and strong.
With a twist-off cap.
Maria, I have something to ask you. Maria, will you?
The Italians' most extravagant gestures are always accompanied by
Will you?
the most extravagant dessert. Wall's Romanza is a sumptuous combination of vanilla ice cream, chocolate toffee pieces, and rich golden biscuit.
Yes.
Romanza. The extravaganza.
Welcome back. It's 9 minutes past 5. Now we have ITN's World News. This edition was broadcast to audiences overseas last night.
Hello, I'm Brenda Rowe with the ITN World News. We'll bring you the top international news and a business report. The top stories. Eyewitnesses say Ceausescu's troops kill Bucharest protesters. American invasion force still faces resistance in Panama. Lockerbie dead are remembered 1 year on. First, security forces in Romania are reported to have opened fire on a crowd which had been jeering at President Nicolae Ceausescu. Both the Yugoslavian agency Tanjug and the Soviet agency TASS said troops fired after demonstrators shouted down President Ceausescu, as he addressed a rally in the country's capital, Bucharest. One report said at least 20 people had been killed. And in the city of Timișoara, where many people were reported killed in last weekend's unrest, workers are said to have occupied factories to demand the resignation of President Ceausescu.
For President Ceausescu, it was meant to be an occasion to castigate his enemies within Romania. To a huge crowd, he said the shootings in Timișoara had been to defend Romania's integrity and sovereignty. Flanked by his wife, he then promised wage and pension rises and urged the people to defend the country against foreign domination. But his broadcast to the nation was suddenly interrupted by protesters screaming. Then the radio went dead before military music was heard. Protesters had gathered near to the square, around the Hotel Intercontinental and the university. But they'd been fired on by soldiers who'd blocked off the entrances. Czech journalist Jan Kokeš told us what happened then.
No, to se zatím nedá přesně povědět, ale v centru se střílelo. Prostě ze samopalů jsou tam tanky, jsou tam sanitky a nad městem helikoptéry. Zmatek, protože oficiální informace prostě neexistují.
A British embassy official, Jonathan Lamb, also witnessed the violence.
In 1 and 1:30, we found people coming away from the demonstration, some of them women in tears, and ambulances. We found a small pocket of student demonstration outside the Hotel Bucharest in Calia Victoriae, and we saw the riot forces go in. They broke up the demonstration, and it appeared that students were being carried away.
Later in the programme, we'll have more eyewitness reports of the unrest in Romania. That's in our special report. The Czechoslovak Communist Party has taken radical steps to try to ensure it's no longer associated with the old hardline leadership. At an extraordinary party congress, the Communists voted overwhelmingly to disband the People's Militia, a paramilitary body used to suppress the government's opponents. There were changes in key roles within the party too. The former Premier, Ladislav Adamec, was elected the new party chairman, but one-time party boss Karel Urbanek was ousted. The Communists are trying to improve their image before free elections in June or July next year. Heavy fighting has continued in Panama between American troops and armed supporters of the country's dictator, General Manuel Noriega. US officials claim the mission's been a success, despite failing to capture General Noriega to face drugs charges. The fighting has been concentrated on the capital, Panama City. The US says 19 of their soldiers have been killed and more than 100 wounded.
The Americans claim that most of Panama City is now under their control, 37 hours after launching their surprise attack on the Noriega regime. In many parts of the capital, the streets seemed quiet as American soldiers patrolled, looking to wipe out any final resistance from members of the Panamanian Defense Force loyal to General Noriega. But fighting was reported from several areas. There were fierce exchanges around the Marriott Hotel. American soldiers were shooting at anything that moved, according to one reporter. It was perhaps a reaction to criticism in Washington that US forces hadn't acted quickly enough to stop Americans being kidnapped at the hotel.
She said, "America, go! No, get out! We need to get her out! You guys see this? Let's go! Come on, get her! Stay down! Stay down! Take care of her!
US troops took over the building and arranged for many of the foreign residents to be driven away in vans. Just how many Americans are being held hostage by Noriega's men, Pentagon officials refuse to say, though they're investigating at least 3 incidents.
We are trying to find out where all of them are. We have a lot of reports. Some of the reports will prove to be true. Some will prove not to be true. The primary mission for the forces who are moving into Panama City today is to find and protect the lives of Americans.
Yet at least 19 American soldiers have died so far in Operation Just Cause. 117 are wounded and one is still missing. City hospitals report that Panamanian casualties are much worse. More than 100 dead, mostly civilians, and more than 1,000 injured. Despite the thumbs-up sign, George Bush may find his decision to go into Panama and the overthrowing of General Noriega with the easy part of a commitment that could last years.
Panama's ambassador to Britain, Guillermo Vega, has accused American troops of being responsible for the deaths of innocent civilians. Senor Vega also said the Americans had bungled their attempt to seize General Manuel Noriega, who was still in Panama.
There are 28 children killed by the Americans. No one seems to worry about that. I mean, at least not the media.
But do you know where in the Republic of Panama General Noriega is? He's definitely in Panama today.
Of course he's in Panama. He spoke 2 times last night to the radio. And that's why the Americans bombarded a building and killed 2 radio men.
A court in Sweden has sentenced a Palestinian to life imprisonment for his part in bomb attacks in Stockholm, Copenhagen and Amsterdam in 1985 and 1986. Abu Talib was found guilty of a range of offences, including attempted murder. He's also still being interrogated about the blowing up of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie in Scotland a year ago. In the town of Lockerbie itself, the anniversary of the bombing has been marked by 3 memorial services to the 270 people who died. A number of American relatives of the victims made a special journey across the Atlantic to be there.
A simple ceremony in a garden of remembrance. A dedication of a memorial stone bearing the names of all of the victims marked the first anniversary of the Lockerbie air disaster. Up on the hillside outside the town, the American relatives came clutching flowers in memory of those they lost.
We are compelled to come and see where our son finally landed. And, while this can be a traumatic experience for us, the worst has already happened to us, so this cannot be worse than that. And once we get back home, that we probably will feel a whole lot better for it.
On the day this first sad milestone is being marked, the people here have expressed the hope that from now on they will be left alone to get on with rebuilding their lives in this quiet Scottish border community. Tonight, the glow from 270 candles, one for each of the victims, lights the garden of remembrance. David Chater, ITN, in Lockerbie.
A charity in memory of one of the victims of the Lockerbie disaster has been launched in London. The Bernd Carlson Trust is named after the United Nations Commissioner for Namibia, who died on Pan Am Flight 103. One of the aims of the trust is to relieve poverty and distress in the Third World. Japan has begun the forcible repatriation of illegal Chinese immigrants. 301 people were put on board a ship at the port of Nagasaki. Japanese officials said they were Chinese who had posed as Vietnamese boat people. Nearly 3,000 boat people arrived in Japan over the summer months. Japan says those found to be Chinese will be repatriated because they illegally entered the country to seek employment. More than 125 Vietnamese boat people have returned home from Hong Kong, having volunteered to go back. They're just a fraction of the 56,000 boat people in detention camps in the British colony. Those who boarded the chartered jet for Hanoi appeared relaxed, a stark contrast to last week's forcible repatriation of another group of boat people.
Surrounded by their few belongings, the boat people spent their last hours at Lo Yu Camp going through the immigration procedures that would finally consign them back to Vietnam. They'd risked their lives to get here, but now they'd accepted that Hong Kong and the rest of the world had no place for them. There was a final gift of aid from the United Nations High Commission of Refugees, $50 American. But there was little else to smile about. Some said they mistrusted assurances that they will be well treated when they get back to Hanoi, and they were being separated too from friends at the center, waiting their turn to go home. Today's quota brings to 750 those who've returned of their own accord. But that still leaves about 57,000 in the camps. And most of them, unlike today's Vietnamese, will be sent back by force. At the present slow rate of progress, some here say the repatriation program could be going on right up until the Chinese take over the colony in 1997. Norman Rees, ITN, Hong Kong.
The two finalists competing to become the first Briton in space have gone back to school to learn Russian. Tim Mace and Helen Sharman have been shortlisted to join the Soviet Juno space mission in 16 months' time. But first, they have to become completely fluent in the language of the cosmonauts. ITN Science editor sent this exclusive report from Star City near Moscow.
The Juno cosmonauts, Helen Sharman and Tim Mace, have been at the Star City Centre near Moscow for over 2 weeks. Most of their time, 14 hours a day, is spent learning Russian, and it isn't easy.
В Москве есть Красная площадь, а в Лондоне что есть? Трафальгарская площадь. Трафальгарская площадь? Да, конечно, Трафальгарская.
Buckingham Palace.
Buckinghamский дворец. Дворец? Дворец, да.
Next March, the cosmonauts will have to be word perfect. Then they'll start lectures on space technology in Russian. For the moment, it's a struggle. Food at Star City is luxurious by Soviet standards, the diet calculated by scientists to give them exactly the right number of calories. The cosmonauts' apartments, too, are rather special for Moscow. But even on the way home for a Christmas break, they found time to brush up on their Russian.
The prospect of being lectured to on the 1st of March in Russian and having to take notes and learn from it is quite daunting.
We've only just learned how to write the stuff. We thought we could read it from books, and then we got there and found that the way they write it, the handwritten words and letters are different from the printed letters, and so we had to learn another set of letters and words.
By comparison with learning Russian, even the cockpit of a 757 looks simple. Lawrence McGinty, ITN, Moscow.
Now business news. The British government says it will end a rule which prevents retailers from offering a discount for cash purchases. The government wants to slow credit buying. It says changing the rule will make cash shopping cheaper than using a credit card. Norway will reduce its support for OPEC next year by increasing oil production to record levels. Norway's oil ministry said the plan is designed to stabilise prices at a reasonably high level. Norway is Western Europe's second biggest oil producer and is not a member of OPEC. Industry ministers from the European Community have unanimously adopted broad powers to control corporate mergers throughout the trade bloc. The law will require that all mergers over a certain financial threshold be vetted first by the Commission. The accord followed 16 years of negotiations to bring mergers under community control. The European market prices on Thursday evening. Gold bullion closed in London down $1 an ounce. North Sea Brent blend oil was unchanged at $19.45 a barrel. The FT 100 index in London closed down 7.7, and on the Frankfurt Bourse, the DAX 30-share index rose 1.46. And now our special report in which we take a more detailed look at one of the stories in the news. And we return to Romania, where large-scale demonstrations have continued in various cities, including Timișoara, where some reports say thousands were killed in a massacre last weekend. With the borders sealed off and the media censored, it's difficult to assess the accuracy of much of the information coming out of the country. But the weight of evidence from foreign tourists leaving Romania lends credence to a picture of a bloody crackdown against anti-government demonstrators.
A black flag flies next to the Hungarian flag within full view of the Romanians at the border crossing point nearest to the town of Arad. Very little private traffic has been seen here since the weekend, but occasionally a group of tourists caught inside Romania are allowed to leave the country. They strip-searched me, says this Polish woman, after passing through the Romanian customs post. She and her friends were in Arad just an hour earlier, the first eyewitnesses of today's violence there to reach the outside world.
On the first floor of one shop, I saw soldiers were taking up positions to shoot. They were preparing their machine guns. It was just by the main street of Arad. Suddenly, we ran out into the street and saw tanks on our right and on the left, just in front of the shops, a huge demonstration with banners, shouting and yelling. We jumped over a fence, got into our cars and drove off very quickly. The whole of Arad was boiling at that moment. We drove 200, maybe 300 meters, and at that moment we suddenly heard bursts of gunfire and explosions. It was terrible.
We are lucky we survived. That's because 2 or 3 minutes after we left the car park, the soldiers fired on the demonstrators.
Black flags also fly over a newly opened hostel for political refugees in the town of Békéscsaba, 12 miles from the border. There are 100 people lodging here, most of them members of the ethnic Hungarian minority in Romania, who've crossed the border in recent days. This man, however, is Romanian, a car mechanic who was in Timișoara last weekend, who took part in the demonstration and who saw the massacre. He can't show his face on camera as his wife and son are still in Romania. The director of the hostel stays with him during the interview, translating his account into Hungarian. The director himself fled Romania 15 years ago.
First, the soldiers warned the crowd to disperse and fired shots in the air. But when they saw that this only enraged the crowd, which was getting bigger and bigger, then the soldiers shot into the crowd. When the soldiers saw that the crowd wasn't dispersing, even when they were shot at, then they drove into the crowd with armored personnel carriers. At that point, several hundred people lost their lives. When the vehicles drove into them, people started fleeing. But these armored carriers went after them, driving over the bodies of the dead and running over the living. Many of the people were chased into Emperor Trajan Square. It's the main center in the town for food shops and restaurants. And there, the crowd set fire to all the shops. They burned down everything they could lay their hands on.
There was one point in the Romanian's account where the director had difficulty in continuing. It was an episode more savage than anything seen even in Tiananmen Square.
As a terrifying warning to the crowd, the security forces strung up the bodies of 3 teenage boys on the monument in the main square. They didn't allow anyone to touch them. They left those 3 corpses there to show the people what happens to those who take part in such events.
The Romanian estimated a total of 2,000 people were killed over the 2 days. He said some army officers had changed sides and joined the demonstrations, and that on Sunday, sections of the army refused to fire into the crowd. His story is, of course, so far unconfirmed by pictures or official reports. At 1 o'clock today, bells rang in all the churches of Békéscsaba. People stood still for a minute, while others lit candles for the dead of Timișoara and other towns. There were similar acts of mourning all over Hungary. There's a great shortage of hard information coming across this border, but it's clear that protest and violent repression is continuing in Romania and that it's widespread. Whether or not it amounts to an organized uprising, people in this border area of Hungary are convinced that it's the beginning of the downfall of Europe's most notorious dictatorship. Gabi Rado, ITN, on the Hungarian-Romanian border.
Now a look at how some of Friday's newspapers are reporting the news. Tokyo's Asahi Shimbun reports 301 Chinese illegal entrants to Japan disguised as Vietnamese refugees have been repatriated to the People's Republic of China. The Straits Times of Singapore reports more heavy fighting in Panama City suburbs as US troops search for General Noriega. The Australian says hundreds of United States elite troops are searching the mountains of northwestern Panama for General Noriega. And that's the world news. Goodbye.
Brenda Rowe with the World News. Coming up after this break, news from American television, including a report on the Jesuit priests in Los Angeles who faced death threats after protesting about US military aid. Join us in a minute.
6 panels we've done.
This shirt smells like we've done 100.
Oh, what a sight.
Oh, what a smelly shirt.
You two need a wash, and so do those shirts.
That's where new Radian Automatic goes into action. Not only does it tackle all kinds of dirt effectively, it also removes stale odours most detergents leave behind.
Now that's more like it.
And it smells clean too.
New Radian removes dirt and odours.
Blend white wine and vodka with peach, apricot, and exotic fruit. And the drink you get is definitely taboo. But blend the same white wine and vodka with the delicious essence of citrus. And that's the incredibly refreshing experience of Mirage. Taboo and Mirage, because moods are never the same.
The restaurant bill caused frustration. I couldn't pay for my crustacean, but flexible is so digestible. Does you does or does you don't take access? Does you does or does you don't take access?
7 million outlets worldwide does.
Ah, Scargill. You can help me wrap the chocolates. There's a marvellous selection at Woolworths. That little shop you found. Here's the Vickers Bourneville. And it's Lint, Almond, Gems, and Gemma. And this Yorkie transporter with 2 corgi cars is young Rupert's. He still talks about the day he pushed you into the lake, you know. And these are for you. The ones with the teeth marks are the hard centers.
Hello again, it's 28 minutes to 6. Coming up in a moment, the news from America. But first, the headlines. Romanians took to the streets in their thousands again last night, just hours after troops had gunned down scores of demonstrators in incidents across the country. In Bucharest, tens of thousands chanted "We won't leave" as tanks surrounded the university square. The East Germans have dismantled the Berlin Wall at the Brandenburg Gate, one of the last symbols of the Cold War. The breach was made just after midnight as cranes pulled away whole segments of the wall. This afternoon, the leaders of East and West Germany will officially open the crossing. At least 40 people have died and dozens were seriously injured in a head-on crash between 2 tourist buses in Australia. The accident happened on the Pacific Highway between Sydney and Brisbane. Some passengers were still trapped in the wreckage 5 hours after the collision. The main news will be coming up at about 5:45. Next, a look at what's making the news on American television. The events in Panama are still dominating coverage by the 24-hour cable news network.
President Bush says U.S. troops will scour Panama for as long as it takes to nab General Manuel Noriega. So far, the ousted leader has outfoxed his would-be captors despite a massive search and a $1 million reward for information leading to his arrest. However, U.S. forces have captured about 1,500 troops from the Panamanian Defense Forces. American troops are battling to crush the last die-hard holdout PDF troops. One serviceman describes the capture of nearly 400 Panamanian soldiers.
After they initially fired us up and they started receiving return fire, they just basically panicked. They dropped their weapons and ran. There were a few that fought us from room to room. It took us about an hour and a half to clear out the barracks area and get those people out of there. But I would say the bulk of them, just once they encountered a stiff resistance, they left. They just ran.
Because of the situation in Panama, there is tension at the U.S. Embassy in Nicaragua, now surrounded by government troops and tanks. Nicaragua ordered the action after U.S. forces took up positions outside the Nicaraguan and Cuban embassies in Panama City. This to make sure General Manuel Noriega does not seek refuge there. Noriega is still on the lam. U.S. officials suspect the general still is in Panama, but they haven't been able to find him or catch him. American forces have been able to nab some 1,500 Panamanian soldiers, some seen here in handcuffs. U.S. troops also have seized a massive stockpile of arms from the Panamanian Defense Forces. A soldier describes the mostly Soviet-made weapons.
In my estimate, I'd say there's right around 1,000 AK-47 assault rifles in here, easily.
President Bush concedes the U.S. offensive in Panama is not over yet, but he says so far, so good. In his first public remarks since he announced the attack, Mr. Bush vowed to keep hunting for the elusive General Noriega. CNN's Charles Bierbauer has more from the White House.
President Bush says the Panama action is pretty well wrapped up, and he declared General Noriega out of business.
Good news, he's out of power. The bad news, he has not yet been brought to justice.
The Bush administration has offered $1 million reward for Noriega's capture so he can be tried in the U.S. on drug trafficking charges.
If there's some incentive for some Panamanian to turn him in, that's a very $1 million that I would be very happy to sign the check for you.
Bush said the pursuit of Noriega is open-ended, so he would like to get U.S. troops home from Panama as soon as possible. That may take a while. Massive looting has accompanied the fighting, and U.S. troops may be the only police force new President Guillermo Endara has to maintain law and order. Endara has to establish new institutions and his own credibility.
Mr. Endara was sworn in on an American military reservation. In other words, he's being imposed on the points of U.S. bayonets, and he hasn't been recognized by other Latin American governments.
The Bush administration considers Endara the legitimate winner of the May elections, which Noriega nullified.
I don't think anybody can suggest somebody else might well have won that election.
But Bush concedes Endara and Panama's economy, which nearly collapsed under U.S. sanctions, need American help.
I think we will feel obligated to try to help in every way possible.
While the president held his news conference, the first bodies of American servicemen began to arrive at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware.
Military casualties are a burden which the nation must endure and all presidents have to face up to, but which we can never accept. And maybe it's just this time of year, but I don't think so.
But otherwise, the president was in a good, almost giddy mood. Members of the Bush family in town for the holidays were on hand. And as the president left, a White House Santa appeared, handing out Christmas ornaments. The president's spokesman joked, "We know no shame at all." Clearly, there is a triumphant mood here. The president's walking around complaining of a stiff neck, but the pain in the neck he's had for a couple of years, General Manuel Noriega, is no longer the threat he once was. Charles Bierbauer, CNN, the White House.
The Pentagon says it's generally satisfied with Operation Just Cause in Panama, but the top brass share President Bush's frustration that Manuel Noriega slipped away. CNN's Carl Rochelle reports on the military's view of the Panama mission so far.
Stressing the positive, the Pentagon says it's routed General Manuel Noriega's military forces.
So as far as the organized resistance is concerned, that's pretty much been taken care of. As far as people in Panama City who are armed, both Dignity battalions and some Panama Defense Force individuals, they are in that city. We are moving in today to get them.
But capturing Noriega himself was another key objective, and that one remains unfulfilled.
We had been tracking Noriega, which was a normal, prudent action on our part, and we went after Mr. Noriega when we had the authority to do that.
But by that time, the dictator was already gone. The U.S. has offered a $1 million reward for Noriega, which prompted dozens of calls, but no results.
We've got him in 3 different countries, 12 different locations in Panama, and 10 different locations in Panama City. We do believe he remains in the country.
Fighting continues in parts of Panama as scattered Noriega loyalists refuse to give up. They were encouraged by a radio message, apparently from Noriega himself, broadcast Wednesday night.
A rallying cry is to overcome or die, not to step backwards, and to come forward the victors.
In Washington, the administration that originally said it wanted first and foremost to apprehend Noriega now appears to be downplaying that goal.
Mr. Noriega, I believe over time, if he is not captured, will become increasingly irrelevant to this whole thing.
But one congressional Democrat quickly reminded the White House of what it set out to do.
I'm afraid from a public standpoint, the capture of Noriega is going to be pretty high on the agenda, and if he is at large, I think a lot of people are still going to feel that the operation wasn't a success.
Despite the failure so far to find the dictator, most military tacticians give the U.S. high marks for pulling off a difficult operation against a lot of targets. The biggest U.S. military action since the Vietnam War, without the number of casualties some planners had expected. Carl Rochelle, CNN, the Pentagon.
A Kentucky jury has convicted Larry Mahoney of 27 counts of second-degree manslaughter. The jury found Mahoney guilty in the worst alcohol-related traffic accident in U.S. history. Today's verdict followed 11 hours of deliberations. The judge in the case read out the manslaughter verdicts. They were all the same except for the names of the victims.
Verdict form number 6. We, the jury, find the defendant, Larry Wayne Mahoney, guilty of manslaughter in the second degree under instruction number 6 as it pertains to Julie Ernest. Verdict form number 5. We, the jury, find the defendant, Larry Wayne Mahoney, guilty of manslaughter in the second degree under instruction number 6 as it pertains to Mary Catherine Daniels.
On May 14th, 1988, Mahoney's pickup truck rammed a church bus near the Kentucky town of Carrollton. The bus burst into flames, killing 24 children and 3 adults. Mahoney admitted he was drunk when he drove his pickup the wrong way on the Kentucky interstate, but his attorney said a faulty gas tank design, not the collision, caused the fire that killed the victims. 3 Jesuit priests in Los Angeles have been shaken by recent threats against their lives. As CNN's Greg Lamont reports, the priests believe the threats are related to their political views on El Salvador.
This Jesuit priest is not only praying for his congregation, he is also praying for his own life. Father Michael Kennedy, along with 2 other priests in Los Angeles, say they have become targeted for death because of their efforts to end U.S. military aid to El Salvador.
Before I went to Mass an hour and a half ago, another priest received a phone call saying that all of us, the 3 of us, were going to die. But what obviously gave me the most fear was it said that Father Miguel, which is myself, that I would be the first one to die.
The people, united, will never be defeated.
The priests have received 6 threatening phone calls and 2 letters amid continuing demonstrations here against the government of El Salvador. The priests have gone to police with their story.
These victims further believe that these telephone calls and these letters and these other crimes were being committed by people from those death squads who were here and operating in the city of Los Angeles.
Police have arrested Carlos Mata, an L.A. businessman with close ties to El Salvador's ruling party, and say he is considered a suspect in the threats against the priests. Just last month, 6 Jesuit priests were shot to death in El Salvador. That country's consul general here in Los Angeles believes the priests are enemies of his country.
They have been backing up terrorist assassins that have demonstrated to the world that they have massacred El Salvador's population. They are backing up the assassins.
The priests say they only want the bloodshed in El Salvador to end, but now fear they may become a part of it.
To get a death threat is a very, very serious matter because these people don't play around.
The priests say they will continue to hold Mass and speak out against El Salvador's government, but will spend many sleepless nights until the threats against their lives end. Greg Lamont, CNN, Los Angeles.
Lawyers for Imelda Marcos say the U.S. and the Philippine government are proposing a deal under which the former Philippine First Lady could escape jail. Racketeering charges against her would be dropped if she pleads guilty to some minor charges. Mrs. Marcos would then be given a suspended jail sentence, but she would be required to fully disclose all her family's assets around the world. And she would have to give the Philippine government millions of dollars of her family's property in the United States. But Marcos's attorney says he expects his client to go on trial in March as scheduled. He says she refuses to plead guilty to any crime committed in the Philippines.
A federal judge has delayed the Iran-Contra trial of former National Security Chief John Poindexter. The postponement until late February is to permit a review of Ronald Reagan's diaries to see whether they are vital to Poindexter's defense. CNN's John Holloman has more.
Reagan has been ordered to turn over personal diary entries and notes from the days of his presidency when arms were sold to Iran and the profits funneled to Nicaragua's Contra rebels. His former national security advisor, John Poindexter, is defending himself from felony charges stemming from the Iran-Contra affair. Poindexter told Congress in 1987 he kept the president in the dark about the secret deals. But now says Reagan knew all about it and authorized everything Poindexter did. In court documents, Poindexter says he can prove Reagan knew by using the former president's personal notes of their frequent meetings. He subpoenaed the papers and Reagan himself to testify. Reagan objected, and so did the Justice Department. But Judge Harold Green ruled in Poindexter's favor, saying his claim that the presidential papers are key to his defense have considerable plausibility.
To protect Reagan's privacy, the judge says he would read the diaries and notes in private, then decide if they're truly relevant. The judge postponed the scheduled start date for Poindexter's trial from January 22nd back to February 20th. It's the second pretrial victory for Poindexter this week. Tuesday, Judge Green sharply limited the case prosecutors can build from the testimony of Colonel Oliver North. President Reagan's Los Angeles office had no comment on the order to provide personal papers. There's still no decision on whether Reagan himself will be forced to take the stand in Poindexter's defense. John Holloman, CNN, Washington.
Those reports in overnight from American television. Now with the time at 5:45, the main news this morning. The Soviet news agency TASS says tens of thousands of people massed on Bucharest's University Square late last night. Troops firing tear gas canisters failed to disperse them. Another 5,000 gathered outside the Intercontinental Hotel. Sporadic shooting has been heard throughout the capital overnight. Meanwhile, the death toll rises. In Bucharest, 20 students were killed as they ran to help people who had been crushed by armoured vehicles. Budapest Radio reported 32 demonstrators shot dead in Cluj. They also say an unknown number of people were killed at Târgu Mureș in Transylvania. At Arad, troops dispersed 3,000 demonstrators, then lined up and shot student leaders.
President Ceausescu addressing a showpiece workers' rally in central Bucharest yesterday. But there were more signs of challenges to his hardline communist rule. Along with the reports of escalating violence throughout the country came jeers and shouts at the rally itself. "Down with Ceausescu" was chanted, interrupting his televised speech and forcing him and the broadcast to stop. Radio listeners heard military music cut in. A Romanian exile who doesn't want to be identified phoned his wife from London. She saw thousands flee the rally only to clash with armed police and troops.
Am văzut și niște mașini blindate, roșii, portiera deschisă și poliția care stăteau cu arma așa, parcă vreau să tragă în oameni. Groaznic.
Cred.
Vreau să mă gândesc dimineața ce știe ce s-a întâmplat, ce cadavre s-au mort, probabil că sunt acum pe străzi. După rafalele astea, cred că n-au fost învăți.
These first pictures of the city of Timișoara show where the protest started. Police still patrol, riot damage is evident. And the demonstrators are getting support from the neighbouring country of Hungary, where marchers turned out in the streets of the capital Budapest, calling for Romania's freedom. In London, a vigil was held outside the Romanian ambassador's residence. Red paint was daubed on his walls and President Ceausescu ridiculed, but many say he is a man who will do all he can to hold on to power.
Romania has virtually sealed its borders. No Western journalists have been allowed into the country since the unrest started. ITN's Penny Marshall has been monitoring events from neighbouring Hungary.
This man was in Timișoara and was at the scene of the first killings. He could not be identified because his wife and child are still inside the country. It's impossible to verify his claims, but they are in line with what other refugees have told us.
I saw soldiers facing some women. A security officer ordered them to shoot the women. They refused, and they threw the guns on the ground. The next thing I saw, the security man had a gun in his hand, and he shot the soldiers.
In Budapest, the Romanian embassy has become the focus for Hungary's shock and anger. Hard facts finally destroying the little hope those with friends in Romania had clung to. Black flags were hung at every public building, including Parliament. Many of the 28,000 Romanian exiles who've made this city their home lit candles for those left behind, enjoying perhaps their newfound freedom to protest, albeit from outside their homeland, for the first time. And as the bells tolled for Romania's dead, the government warned people here not to do anything to provoke Romania. Hungary's foreign minister said he was about to end the 40-year friendship between the two countries in protest.
At least 40 people have died and dozens were seriously injured in a head-on crash between two tourist buses in Australia. The accident happened on the Pacific Highway between Sydney and Brisbane. Police said it was the worst crash in Australian history, and some passengers were still trapped in the wreckage 5 hours after the collision. American troops in Panama are still facing resistance from soldiers loyal to General Noriega. As his first act, the country's new president, Guillermo Endara, imposed an overnight curfew to try to stem widespread looting and a breakdown in law and order.
As American troops fanned out across Panama to hunt for Manuel Noriega and to restore law and order, there remained uncertainty about the number of foreign hostages in the hands of Noriega supporters. There was drama at Panama City's Marriott Hotel. 200 foreigners, most of them Americans, were trapped there during fierce fighting. As terrified hotel guests were herded into lorries, the tension increased.
Watch your tree!
In the end, the lorries literally smashed their way out of the hotel car park to safety. In the surrounding streets, anarchy. With no one to stop them, Panamanians went on a looting spree. General Noriega now has 24,000 American soldiers on his trail and a $1 million reward on his head. George Bush is making no apologies for offering the cash.
His picture will be in every post office in town. That's the way it works. He's a fugitive drug dealer, and we want to see him brought to justice.
At Dover Air Force Base in Delaware, a painful reminder of what it's all cost. The first bodies of Americans killed in action were flown home. The question for George Bush now, how long must his troops stay, and what, in the end, will be the price of maintaining American control?
General Noriega is thought to be still inside Panama, near the Costa Rican border, from where Ken Reese now reports.
300 miles from Panama City, the dense jungle on the border could hide an army and a fugitive general. The general's picture still looks down the main street of this frontier town, which has one foot in Costa Rica, the other in Panama. Citizens of both sides were still free to come and go today, but journalists, especially Americans, were turned back onto the Costa Rican side. We walked onto the Panama side to ask people what they knew. They told us that there was a large contingent of pro-Noriega forces in the region and strong rumors that the general himself might be hiding near a town some 40 miles away. They were fearful. Perhaps the Americans will land here, one man said. God will decide what happens. I don't care if Noriega stays or goes, so long as they leave me alone. The question these people want an answer to is who's in charge of their country. Is it General Noriega, who's believed to be hiding out in these hills somewhere, or is it the United States? And until that question's resolved, their feeling is that the less they say about this situation, the better.
The East Germans have dismantled the Berlin Wall at the Brandenburg Gate, one of the last symbols of the Cold War. The breach was made just after midnight as cranes pulled away whole segments of the wall. This afternoon, the leaders of East and West Germany will officially open the crossing.
The Brandenburg Gate came to symbolise the Cold War division of Germany since it was sealed off by the Berlin Wall. To the jubilation of onlookers, East German workers began their historic task. More than 1,000 people were waiting on the western side of the wall for this, the most important of the 20 crossings that have been opened since East Germany lifted travel restrictions 6 weeks ago. The work went on through the night as piece by piece the barrier came down. Then, the moment they'd all been waiting for. The first segment of the wall wrenched from its roots by East German cranes. It was another night of celebration. This afternoon, the two German leaders, Chancellor Helmut Kohl and Prime Minister Hans Modrow, will meet at the new crossing. But for now, a simple handshake was enough for the Berliners.
A government inspector is to test airport security by trying to smuggle fake explosives onto aircraft. He will pose as a terrorist to check new safety measures introduced after the Lockerbie bombing. A court has heard how security at Gatwick was breached when a student was able to walk into the cockpit of a parked Ward Air jet. He was only discovered when he tried to start the aircraft and engineers working on an engine felt a blast of air. The former Tory party chairman Norman Tebbit has delivered his strongest condemnation yet of government plans to give 225,000 Hong Kong residents the right to live in Britain. He said the decision has split the party from top to bottom and would drive voters into the welcoming arms of the Labour Party. The people of Lockerbie have been remembering those who died when a bomb exploded on board Pan Am Flight 103 a year ago. American and British relatives are in the Scottish border town to commemorate the 270 who were killed.
At this time, 1 year ago, this square was full of confusion and bewilderment, a community overwhelmed, its town hall a temporary mortuary.
All of us today have made a painful journey back in time to relive each moment of a day ever in our mind. We have changed. But to say that we can never live life joyfully again is to say to the terrorists, here you can have our lives as well. That I refuse to give them. We have dedicated a memorial in Drysdale to all who died. We have lit candles round it as a sign of life, light, hope, and eternal love.
In the hills above Lockerbie, another service. The church at Tundergarth has been a place of pilgrimage for American relatives. It was close to here the cockpit of the clipper Maid of the Seas fell. Back in the town square, the memorial service ended with a lone piper playing the Flowers of the Forest.
And that's the news so far today. Join us again at 5 o'clock tomorrow. Good morning.
Take a quiet moment to discover gold. Galaxy Gold. Filled with rich continental truffle. Galaxy Gold. The chocolate created for a spell of decadence.
Mr. Taylor, will you tell us about your sore throat?
It's too sore.
Pardon?
It's too sore.
Then you need something that works very fast. Chloroseptic.